You're listening to the Cricket Podcast.
Talk about SA20.
That's the
Right, the South African 20, the SA20. It's this name is going to really annoy me. It's like when Punjab Kings changed their name from Kings 11. It took me probably 3 seasons to still not quite over it now. The auction took place on Monday, and a hell of a lot of money was spent on some big name players. Dan, can I get your sort of first thoughts on what you thought of the auction in general? Whether you thought there was a clear winner or a loser, any players that you thought sold for more money than they should have done, and then I've got some notes on Bavuma, who in some senses ends up being the real story of the auction, which is a little bit disappointing on a day which should have been really positive, I think, for South African cricket.
Yeah, I think that there's 4 teams who look better than the rest, than the other 2 to start with. The 2 trailers, I would say, would be Durban, who have managed to assemble a real bizarre mix of overseas players in particular.
Yeah.
And my old friends at Sunrisers who have pretty much done the same thing. So yeah, it's certainly some strange picks up there. What I found really weird, and I was quite surprised about this, because obviously we know that all the teams are owned by IPL franchises, was that I felt that the auction was pretty naive from a lot of teams' perspectives, in that we saw some really sort of random price wars early doors. So like a Lungi and Gidi it was cheap in the first round. Everyone was a bit like, oh well, cautious in the first round, which kind of happens in the IPL auction a little bit as well. 3.4, I think he went for 3.4 million rand, and then Sisanda Magala, I think it was, went for like 5.2 later on, which is just crazy. And that was one player I felt was really wildly overpriced. I can understand a lot of the other big purchases. So like Tristan Stubbs, obviously is someone who's got massive potential, but is he there yet? We'll see. Is Donovan Ferreira will be the same as someone that has been on my radar for a little while as well. That's someone who's got some really nice all-round package as well.
We talk just quickly, because a few people asked us about Donovan Ferreira and who he is. Can you give a 30-second summary of who Donovan Ferreira is?
Yeah, no, I looked at him. I did a lot of research on him before the IPL auction, actually. He bowls some right arm off spin, but his primarily role will be a finisher who's just got brutal power, brutal intent, like just another Stubbs type player, basically, just high boundary percentage, high 6%. Smashes it. Yeah. So, and the other things that I found really weird was that, like, some players got passed up and like rejected, no one bid for them to start with, and then when they came back into the auction later on, there was like a massive bidding war for them. And I'm like, you never see that in the IPL ever. Like, you would never see someone who gets bought back go for like 10 crore, which is pretty much the equivalent of like a few of the players he did in South Africa. So it made me feel that the talent ID wasn't particularly strong. The auction strategies weren't particularly strong. I think there was a lot of bargains out there if you're pretty astute about it. Someone like Vian Mulder, for example, not being picked up first time, and I think he went for about $100,000 in the end, was a good example of that. And like, there was no way the guy should have gone unsold to start with. He's just been player of the tournament in English 50 over tournament. He was very, very good in the T20 Blast as well. And so for me, that was, and all-rounders are just, real rare commodities as well. So it was just ridiculous that he didn't get a bid, I think, at 175, and then ended up getting bid up to like almost 2 million rand in the end, which is just nuts. And also the other thing I spoke a bit about the Durban and the Sunrisers overseas bizarreness, I suppose, is a word. But yeah, what I noticed having looked at the player list is that the quality dropped off pretty quickly for overseas players. So like people might say, "Oh wow, like some really random picks, like an Adam Rossington, for example, getting picked up."
Yes. Yeah.
But you
Who
look at
else?
that, there's no keepers. There was no good overseas keeper batters in the list. So that's a resource dynamic that you have to kind of take into account a little bit as well. And I suppose to some degree you could also say that's one of the reasons why Durban picked up like a Johnson Charles, but they don't really needed backup keeper because they got class.
Didn't on Sunrisers, didn't they pick up Jordan Cox already before they shelled out for Adam Rossington? Just to, really
I
push
think,
Sunrisers.
yeah, think of that. That's yeah. That's, but then maybe they want Jordan Cox field because he's probably the best fielder in England.
Okay, fair enough.
But yeah, you're right, and I think that it's indicative a little bit of the player pool in South Africa and the stretched player pool in these overseas leagues right now, because we're seeing players perhaps get deals who you wouldn't have expected to get deals over the last couple of years.
I think I think it'll be quite an interesting tournament. I
Yeah,
I think the symptom or the cause of some of the interesting prices, I think, is because it is, and I don't think there's any secret, it is effectively an IPL development tournament. And I
yeah,
think that the reason some players who maybe don't have the greatest track record but have had a promising age 20 season have gone for a load of money is because these franchises see it as a route into building a relationship. And if there's rumors, aren't there, that the auction might be a thing of the past at the IPL. Well, how are you going to, if it's a free agency market, having an established relationship with Donovan Ferreira might mean that you can knock a couple of crore off his price in a free agency dynamic.
purchase,
Yeah, and the upfront costs that you shell out here to assess him and to build that relationship, you might see it as not actually that massive in the scheme of the IPL.
I think we've also seen that a couple of other things in that sort of IPL dynamic as well. In the we're seeing players getting picked up by teams around the world, like in terms of the group of
Yeah,
clubs, if you like. So Ramon Simmons going to Paul Royals, having only played 5 T20 matches in his whole career as a local player, but that's for Barbados Royals.
yeah.
So obviously they've seen enough in him to suggest that
We'll
that's
have
someone
another
they
look.
want to try and have another look at, get more data on, get more exposure for, and build that relationship with, like you say. So we're starting to see a little bit of that as well. So it's interesting to look at it from kind of those multifaceted approaches.
Yeah, I think away from the cricketing dynamic, I think there is the other big story is obviously that Temba Bavuma, the South African T20 captain, wasn't selected, and I think this ends up being a bit of a PR disaster for the tournament because the auction had generated quite a lot of positive interest. I think, like, it had been well produced and well marketed, and it seemed like a lot of these players were going to get a payday domestically, and that it could be something that you could use as a foundation for South African cricket in the longer term. Then the South African captain doesn't end up getting selected, and there are cricketing reasons for this. He was listed, I think it was 850,000 rand, when the base price was 175,000 rand. And if you look at his T20 stats versus some of those guys on the base price, there isn't an awful lot to choose between them. Now, I think he's a better player than some of the guys that have ended up being selected. But if you are looking at it in a really critical run per rand, from a really critical run per rand point of view, I think you could make that argument. But it looks pretty bad if you're running a T20 league in South Africa and you haven't picked the South African captain who happens to be black in said domestic tournament. Especially when you've negotiated with the government that there won't be a quota system in this tournament, that it'll be a best v best thing. I feel like Cricket South Africa have made a bit of a blunder. let's say, and I think they should perhaps have thought a little bit harder about how some of their their big names, how they would distribute them around the tournament. But it is what it is. I think there's some potential issues that they'll have. I doubt the South African government will love it, but we'll see. What comes out of that. In other leagues, in other similar leagues, you do see centrally contracted players sort of automatically allocated and stuff, don't you, Dan? That might have avoided this issue.
Yeah, the 100 is obviously one where that's happened with centrally contracted players getting deals with teams and being sort of allocated to teams from to some extent. But I don't know, like I quite like. I've been very vocal on the fact that I like a meritocracy, complete meritocracy over for selection and recruitment and stuff like that, and I like market forces. And I think the biggest problem for me is that the reserve prices were wildly different from top to bottom in terms of there wasn't really many brackets. So I mean, we saw exactly the same thing happen. Not obviously with the international captain, but we saw a very similar thing happen in the first edition of the 100, where I think Samit Patel, Ollie Stone, and perhaps Joe Denley from memory, but definitely the first two, I think, put the reserve up pretty high and didn't get contracted. So we have seen that, and generally speaking, I think that unless you're, an unbelievable world class player who's flying halfway around the world to make an effort to play in a tournament, you probably should just stick your reserve in as low as possible.
I think that's a fair point to make. I think in South Africa there's a particular issue, isn't there? Because you have the whole history of South Africa to deal with, and if you're going to run a domestic tournament there, I think you do need to factor that in. And people can complain about the quota system and that as much as they want, but the reality is you don't have a South African national team unless you have that. So you have to work with what you've got.
Well, I think it's fair to say that both would you say both of us will agree that if his reserve was 175, he'd have got a deal.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I don't think there's any doubt about it. To be honest, I think some of his T20 stats look probably worse than they would have been if he'd played more at home as well, where he strikes at a higher rate than he does away. So probably actually a reasonable pickup, but there were a lot of players in that auction, and a lot of them, if as you say, Dan, the talent idea isn't great, look just base numbers wise pretty similar to Temba Bavuma, and that I think that's where you need some positive intervention from if you're Cricket South Africa, to be honest. But they didn't do it, and we have a few questions in. We'll try and get through them relatively quickly. So we had one in, we got a couple in yesterday from the Cricket Selection G on the county championship. The first is about the kind of new format. And Dan, I don't know if you want to take this one. What are your thoughts on the new 6-team Super Premier League in the championship? Would that work or not?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it, to be honest with you, as long as there's a decent promotion and relegation system. So effectively, every team has got an opportunity to fight their way into that top six over, say, a 2-year period or something like that, or a 1-year period. Then I've got no qualms with that at all. I do think we play too much red ball cricket in England because it's far more than every other country in the world, and unfortunately, for the greatest one in the world, it's not as commercially viable as other formats. And so for me, it makes more sense to do that. Now, 6v6v6 or 6, and then 2 divisions of equal divisions after that, if you like. It's 10 games, then you've got playoff matches as well. There's going to be a bit of a departure in games played, but I've got no issue with it whatsoever. I've got more of an issue with the fact that people are talking about playing blast games on a Friday night, which is going to be an absolute nightmare for recruiting overseas players, because like you can't. It's hard enough to get them when tournaments are played in block, let alone on a Friday night. Now, and I know that the players are really not fans of switching formats every week and week, like all the time as well. So that's something else that should be considered. For me, it's a no-brainer, really. You get the 50 over comp done in April, do it as a knockout, do it as a small group stages, do it with minor counties, do it with Scotland and Netherlands and teams like that. Whatever you want to do, it's fine. Championship, May, June, July, 100 after that, something like that. Or you could do 100 towards the back toward halfway through August and have the last couple of games in Championship at the start of August as well. Like this stuff's pretty easy. Or you did blast in the block, obviously as well. Towards at some point in that sort of May to July schedule as well.
We had another question on the Championship from G, who just wanted us to comment on Lancashire v Essex. Lancashire won by 38 runs. All 20 wickets have fallen by mid-afternoon on day 2. The highest score in the match is 131. That was Lancashire in the first innings. It went 107, 131. No, sorry, 131, 107, 73, 59. That's a shocker, isn't it? Let's be honest. Like that's
is that the first team? I've got no idea if this is the case, but they've got to be the first team who have won after being 7 for 6. But to be fair, like I saw a few of the shots in the match, and players didn't cover themselves with glory either. I'm sure the pitch was very assisting, but I saw possibly the weirdest shot I think I've ever seen in a 4-day game from Steve Croft, and I saw Dan
drive to slip.
And Dan Lawrence play a really loose shot to mid wicket, first ball in Balderson's hat trick, and the second ball of the hat trick. And yeah, there was some of the options weren't great. I think it's fair to say as well.
All right. So the questions from today, we got a few in. So Gurjot says, "Do you think Chahal's attacking bowling is sustainable in T20 eyes?" So he's come under a little bit of pressure, hasn't he, for India with his leg spin? I still think he's India's best leg spinner. Am I wrong?
No, I agree.
There we are. Any reason you drop him?
Not really. I don't see there to be a better option really if you're going a leg spin like for like.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm fine with just persisting with him. Cool.
The Shepherd asks, between the IL T20, it might be. It doesn't look like him. It could be. Romario Shepherd asks, between IL T20 and the SA20, which one do you think will get the most eyeballs? Which do you think will end up being more popular? There's a couple of questions to this following questions about whether CSA need to market this and whether it's on them to build a franchise, a fan base. But initial impressions?
I think both of them are going to be pretty massive, to be honest with you. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was surprised at the level of interest in the auction the other day. It was massive. I think that the IL20 has got an advantage over the SA1 in terms of having fewer overseas restrictions and maybe got in quicker to get a lot of the better overseas players as well into that comp. So for me, I wouldn't be surprised if the IL1 was a slightly higher caliber of tournament quality-wise, but I think both of them are going to be really, really successful and be great additions to the yearly calendar.
Yeah, I get the impression that the IL20... Actually, you know what? I think the SA20 will end up being slightly higher quality, but there'll be better players in the IL. So does that make sense? Like, I think that the worst player... the worst player in South Africa is a lot better than the amateur players, basically, in the UAE comp. So that is sort of my answer on that, I suppose. I also think that because South Africa is already a kind of a top tier cricketing nation, it will be easier to market and to sell the competition there than it will be the slightly more contrived version in the UAE. But we'll see they'll have obviously in the UAE they'll probably have more money to throw at it, so you never really know which way that'll work out. Random cricket stats asked, in light of Cam Green and Harry Brooks' recent performances, who are some other youngsters under 25 who have the potential to be all format superstars in your opinion?
I think that is overvalued, overrated. I don't think that there's many players who are going to be able to last across all three formats, either from a fitness or a. I certainly don't see Cameron Green with the back problems that he's had of being able to play all three formats on a long-term basis. He could be kind of one of those rare players, but as I sort of said earlier, maybe compared to AB de Villiers, could he end up being one of the generational talents? I don't find those players who are as good at a high level in all three formats, really. And yeah, there's probably a few out there, but players' careers tend to change dynamics as they might start off as like intent merchants in T20 and then kind of try and get that coached out of them a little bit to some degree. We've seen that maybe with the Pant to some extent in the India setup. So, but obviously now he's become a very, very effective wicketkeeper batsman in Test cricket, and that's a shame, I think, in terms of his development in T20 cricket. So hard to be above average in all three formats.
Okay, so we had some questions from Chatil, Ponraj and Sura, but I think we kind of answered them in the course of the chat. The last question I wanted to get to wrap up the show is from Coxal, who he asked a question about Punjab. I'm not going to ask it directly about that, but the substitution rule he brings up. So there are strong rumours that there'll be a substitution rule in the IPL next year. I think they're going to trial it in the Syed Mushtaq Ali Trophy, which starts next month. How would you utilise a sub in T20 cricket?
Well, first of all, I'm kind of very pro any opportunity to have a competitive advantage over the other team in terms of making better decisions. So a sub opportunity to do that is one way of doing it for sure. Now, there's various ways of utilizing that sub. The obvious way is if someone gets injured, for example, because I always find it was so archaic that like a fast bowler could pull their hamstring in the first ball of the match, and you can't sub him. You can't sub him off, and it reminds me of like football in the 50s or something like that, But obviously, from a strategic basis, if in a 25-player squad in the IPL, you've got 4 overseas players who aren't playing as well, you'd like to think that you've got all skill sets covered to adapt to those match situations. So, for example, if you're 3 down after six overs, you might want to put in a sub in another batter, for example, or a finisher or something like that to give yourself the opportunity to take advantage of the death overs. Or by the same token, if you've smashed 200 for 2 of 16 overs, you might want to sub off your number 7 and bring in another frontline bowler, for example. Yeah. I don't know. These are just all different situations. You might see that the pitch is spinning, you didn't expect it to, so you want to sub in an extra spinner. And all these type of things allow you to take tactical, strategic decisions that a good team will back themselves to make better decisions than their opposition. And it's, to be honest with you, something I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah, I think I had to think about this. Because my initial reaction was that I didn't love it, but then I did think about it, and I was like, actually, no, it just adds narrative layer and things you can talk about. And as you say, it's something that a good team management will do well, and a bad team management won't do well. And I think it will expose some of the crap coaches who you would presume won't do as well. And we haven't even talked about Brian Lara getting the gig on this podcast yet, but I would speculate that Stephen Fleming at Chennai Super Kings will make better decisions than Brian Lara at Sunrise next year, to take 2 random names from the history of the IPL. Um, I can see it working. I think there's a balance issue that could potentially come into play. For instance, in the 200, you hit 200 for two example, and then you get to exploit that position by bringing in a pace bowler. Although on the flip side, if the other team can withdraw one of their bowlers to bring in, I don't know, Tim David,
Yeah.
or somebody who can slog it, then that might balance out, and you might see a more exciting game overall. As I think that there are balance questions about it, and as long as they're thought about and worked out well, then I don't have a problem. I wouldn't like it to go too far. I'd say that I'm not one of those people who thinks that you should be able to use like your whole squad of 20 on a match day and make substitutions left, right, and centre. I still think that the strategic trade-offs that a team might make by playing a better bowler at number 8 who can't really bat versus playing a better batter who can't bowl as well are interesting tactical dynamics as well, and tie T20 cricket fundamentally to the origins of the sport, which a slightly more pure bat v ball type game, because that strategic decision you make there does affect how everyone else in the team has to bat, and there's there's a whole load of interesting decisions that have to happen as a result of that. And I don't want to see I don't want to see T20 cricket lose that, because I think that's good, and you've got baseball if you want to see loads of substitutions, or the NFL. Like, watch the NFL. It's literally, a team of specialists playing a team of specialists, and you see some great stuff. But I don't think T20 cricket needs to go down that route to make it engaging. It's already a fantastic format. I think this is a nice twist on it. I don't know if I'd go further. I don't know if you'd agree with that. You might be a full transformationist.
I don't know. Jury's out for me. I want to see one sub, and then we'll go from there. But I don't mind the idea of 2 or 3.
I wouldn't mind, like for concussion subs, you can swap a batter for a batter or a bowler for a bowler. I wouldn't mind it. I think I wouldn't mind, say, 3 if it were that you had to do that. And I don't know how you decide. I don't know how you bracket the players necessarily. But I don't want to see. I mean, I think it's quite funny. Well, not funny. I think some of the best finishes to games are when wickets lost are also a factor in a chase, for example. And when you get like a number 10 that needs to hit 2 off the last 2 balls, that is just as a thrilling a conclusion and as exciting as if it's a competent player that has to hit 4 off 2 balls.
Yeah,
it's just a different thing, and I don't think you need to contrive situations in T20 cricket. I think the format works. A little bit of tactical nuance, I'm all for that. Just be careful what you wish for, is what I'd say.
No, fair, yeah. But I do like the idea of the sub, one sub, and I'm actually pretty sad that the bash boost point is off the top of the
well, do you know what I think will happen with the expansion of effectively the minor leagues of the IPL in South Africa and UAE, and to some extent the CPL? I think one of them will be really radical. They'll trial a load of stuff in those, and if it works really well, then I can hold my hands up and say it's a great innovation. But I think, if we're saying the IPL is the major leagues, then I don't think you fuck around with that first. I think you make sure it works in the UAE, in the IL20 before you change the big show or the World Cup or anything like that.
We're obviously going to try it in a SMAT and see what happens from there.
Yeah. All right, Dan, it's been a pleasure having you on. Is there anything you want to plug before we wrap up?
Just the usual, really. On Twitter at SA Advantage and danweston.substack.com. Cool.
We're at the Cricket Pod on Twitter and Instagram. Head over to Patreon, patreon.com/thecricketpod to support the show directly. Everyone there, it was greatly appreciated. And as I said right at the beginning, we spoke to Cheteshwar Pujara, the actual Cheteshwar Pujara, on our last episode. So go back and give that a listen. if you want to hear his thoughts on a range of topics. Cheerio, everyone.